This is an interview with Carol Barnes for the Women, Politics, and Activism Since Suffrage project at her home in Palm Desert, California. The interview is being conducted by Natalie Fusakis on March 17, 2016. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
You're most welcome.
Can we start with when were you born?
I was born 41, so I just hit 75 in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Can you talk a little bit about your childhood and family life growing up in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, I was the third of three children, but my two brothers, it was almost as if there were three only children in my family. My oldest brother was 20 and a half years older than I was, and my second brother was 12 years older than I was. And so, you know, I was obviously, my mother, and back then you had your children young. My mother was almost 42 when I was born. So I always teased her. I said, I was an accident, wouldn't I? Wasn't I? And she'd give me this, oh, I always wanted a girl stuff. Yeah, sure. So I led a fairly normal life for a kid on the west side of Ann Arbor, which was the towny side, until my father took seriously ill with leukemia just before I was 10. And he died 2 days after my 10th birthday. And my mother really, other than the house, she really didn't have any money because the money just went to my father's health care back then. So at that point, it was very, very different. My mother went to work as a secretary at the church. She actually had 2 years of college, which was fairly unusual for a woman born in 1898.
Right.
But she was not really prepared to do anything. She had gotten married when she was, I don't know what age, I don't know what year they got married. I have a record of it somewhere. But anyway, she quit work to raise a family. And so I was the kid who, my oldest brother was probably more like a father to me. And my mother was sort of, when I would say I was bored in the summer when I was a little kid, she'd give me 10 cents and say, go ride the bus. And so I used to go 2 blocks away where the city bus picked me up, and I would spend my 10 cents, and I knew how to get transfers everywhere. So I used to go all over town. My favorite place was the Natural History Museum at the university and the music department, because I was taking both piano and violin lessons. My mother scraped together the dollars to do that. And so I'd go listen to the University of Michigan Orchestra practice, and you just haunt around. You know, the archaeology department was always interesting to go to. And so I was pretty quiet child until the bus ride started. And then I became quite extrovertive. If you give me one of those temperament sorters,
Right.
like Dave Kiersey modified and used to use with his, he was on campus, he was chair of the counseling department. And give me one of those, I'll come out as ENTJ, very extrovertive and very judgmental. And that hasn't changed much. But I think the extroversion came as a child because I would talk with everybody on the bus, regardless whether they were from the lowest echelon of society or housewives, because back then people only had one car.
Right.
You didn't find many two-car families. And so there might be a housewife on the bus. It might be, you know, a real low-income person. The west side of Ann Arbor was very racially mixed, blacks and Anglos. My dad built the house that we lived in, and it was about a block away from a very, very rough neighborhood in Ann Arbor. At least every weekend it seemed like there was somebody shot or murdered. And it was a enclave of lower, very low income, if any income, blacks in Ann Arbor.
Wow.
And so it was an interesting experience because I went to school with those kids.
Right.
And I remember one of the recent high school reunions, this woman whom I'm going to talk about was actually there. And I asked her about this. She didn't remember it at all. But she was a large, it was in like 4th, 5th grade maybe, large black girl. And she used to chase me home every day. And I knew every cut through people's yards and how to sneak through. And she did that a lot. And I confronted her at probably the 50th high school reunion. And I said, "Do you remember that?" She says, "No memory of that at all." And I said, "Well, you did." I hadn't forgotten it. So, all of those experiences probably shaped what I think about people and so on. I went to elementary school. It was about 6, 7 blocks away. And then junior high school, it was about a mile away. And of course, walked. And I tell my children it was uphill both ways in the snow.
Of course it was.
And then I went to, when I graduated from Ann Arbor High School, that was really the main high school in town. There was the university had a small training school, university high school, and then there was a Catholic high school. But as far as real public high schools, there was one. So we had the farm kids. There was a lot of, Ann Arbor then did not look like it does now. There were a lot of farms, and the farm kids were bussed in, and those of us in the city had to walk. But it was I had a good time in high school. I was very active in student government, which figures,
right.
And I was we used to call it concert mistress of the orchestra. I was a very serious violinist. I played the piano. I used to accompany a lot of people in concerts and so on. And so it was fun.
What did you do in student government? Yeah.
Oh, I was a representative of one group, and I was on a lot of committees. I wasn't student body president. That was a whole different class of kids. I wasn't in that social group. I was more in the group where I represented groups of people and so on. But the kids that I used to hang out with in high school were more the, I don't want to say brainiacs, but some of the smarter kids.
Right.
And where it was socially expected to get good grades.
Right.
There was no pejorative attitude about, if there was any pejorative attitude toward me, it was probably because I was a violinist. Back then, I remember at one high school reunion, it's fun to go back to these reunions, one guy who was a baseball player said, "God, all I remember you was carrying that violin case around." But he used to cut school. And that's when we had one car. I dropped my mother off at work and then went to school. And I shouldn't admit this on camera, but I stole a pack of off-campus passes from the music teacher's desk. And I used to sign myself out. But I didn't do anything bad. I used to go up to the old university library and hang out in the stacks and go in there and find all these things that were really old and where it looked interesting. Or I would go over to the music department and watch the orchestra play. In fact, the summer, by the time I was like junior and senior in high school, I played in the Ann Arbor Civic Symphony. I played in the statewide youth symphony orchestra, and I was actually second chair in that. And then the summer after I graduated high school, the University of Michigan let me play in their orchestra.
Wow.
And I didn't want to be a music major because I said I don't want to spend my life with no weekends and spending it in an orchestra sitting somewhere. So then, of course, we had no money, so I went to the University of Michigan. I was fortunately eligible, and I had scholarships, which really helped. But I foolishly married my high school sweetheart at age 18. You know, we all did those things. We stayed married for 29 years.
What was his name?
Gary Barnes.
Okay. And how did you all start dating or?
Oh, we were in high school.
Yeah.
You know, he was with the group of guys that were in our kind of social group, and his parents sent him to Ann Arbor High School his senior year. He had been going to the lab school at Eastern Michigan University because his mother worked there. And he was getting in all kinds of trouble. I mean, he had a cherry wine producing outfit in his locker at high school, and he used to put Volkswagens up on the sidewalk. And one time he set up a hydrogen sulfide generator in the library. And very smart guy, smart guy, but bored out of his gourd. And so they said he had to shape up, and they sent him to Ann Arbor High School for his senior year. So that's when I met him.
And did he go to the University of Michigan also?
Yes, he did. Aeronautical engineering.
And before we move on to Michigan, I want to ask two other questions about where were your parents originally from?
My mother grew up in a little town in Michigan. If you think of Michigan as being, let's see, I'll orient it to you, the thumb, like this, the mitt and the thumb. She grew up about there. It was a little town called Embley City. My dad grew up in Ann Arbor. His grandparents immigrated to Ann Arbor in the mid-1800s. His grandfather was a tailor and worked at the nicest men's store in Ann Arbor. And then his father used to build houses, not the successful contractors that we see today. But
And where did they immigrate from?
Well, Germany. They were from a part of Germany which would now be in Poland, but of course then it was the German Empire, and they all spoke German, very German. I grew up with a lot of German food. I still like it. My mother's was she said she was very much a polyglot when it came to background. She was about English, Irish, and German as far as we can tell, and her family came through, well, she said she was Scots-Irish really, but her maiden name was McKillen, but it was spelled with M-C. Okay. And figured it was from Northern Ireland, which, historically was, the Scots and the Irish were like this there, back and forth. So.
And what was your dad's name?
Reinhold, R-E-I-N-H-O-L-D,
wow.
German, Reinhold, and Walter Pardon, P-A-R-D-O-N. And that was my maiden name. And I grew up hating it when someone thought they were the original ones to think of this. They would say, "Oh, pardon me, Miss Pardon." And I'd go, "Groan," another time. So anyway, that was my...
And what did your father do for a living before he got leukemia?
Well, he was working as a draftsman at a place called the American Brooch. They used to design machinery. And, well, he worked there. He had a lot of different jobs. I don't know why he switched jobs so much, other than the fact that I think he probably had that German temperament that would tell somebody off. And he worked there when I was a child, I think right before he got ill, and it was an acute illness. They determined it in October, and he died in January. I think he was working at a local lumber yard, but I know that there's a big bell tower, big carillon on the University of Michigan campus, and I know he worked on building that.
Neat.
So he was just, never unemployed as far as I can tell, but always doing something either construction or so on. He actually had, when I was going through school, I worked at the Office of Registration and Records at Michigan because I had, we're married, I had to work, and we had scholarships and he had to work. But anyway, so I dug up my dad's college record. And he actually had 3 years of college in chemical engineering. He was a smart guy. But my mother said he developed a severe allergy to the chemicals. And my hypothesis is that he was probably handling some stuff that were carcinogens, because there was not a history of cancer in his family. It was all heart disease that killed them, strokes and heart attacks. So, but instead of changing to another engineering major, which normally one would do, he just dropped out of school. And I know he was in, no, I'm trying to think, yeah. I have a picture, about the only real picture I have of him, shows him in military type uniform. So he was apparently an ROTC. Okay. And so.
How engaged in politics was your mom, or do you remember your dad being?
Neither of them, but they were very, very staunch Republicans, which was unusual for the social class that we were in. In fact, I had a high school history teacher whom I really liked. He was a brilliant guy. He had taught at the university part-time, and he was talking about how you can determine, at that time at least, someone's political preference by their income level and where they lived. And he had checked where we all lived, and he kind of had an idea from income levels and so on. And he asked us to raise our hands who was Republican and who was Democrat. And he looked at me and said, "You're a Republican?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, how did you decide to be a Republican?" I said, "Well, I don't know. My parents were Republicans." That's how kids decide.
Right.
And he was a bit flabbergasted because of the social class that I grew up in. We really, once my mother died, we had no money.
Right.
I mean, I had to work all the way through. I started when I was a kid, 10 years old. We had a big patch of raspberries in the backyard, and I used to pick raspberries and peddle them through the neighborhood. And my mother, to get extra money, we picked raspberries, and she sold them at the farmer's market. And then I found a patch of rhubarb. So when I was selling my raspberries, I put them in a little wagon and walked them around the neighborhood. I gathered up some of the rhubarb, sold that too. And then the minute I could work, which was age 14, I got a job in a men's clothing store, a really good men's clothing store in Ann Arbor. And those were funny experiences because often they had me work at the Boy Scout counter. They sold the Boy Scout stuff in town. But I would have to do anything. I mean, I remember one time, a kid that I went to high school, "You're going to have to weed out stuff on this tape." But this kid came in and asked for a jock strap. And I said, "Well, they come in different sizes. What size?" And he says, "Oh, extra large." He was a puny little kid. So I had many funny experiences working in this men's store because I had to work to have any money. So and I knew that the owners of the store would tell me I could go home if it wasn't busy. So I used to take the men's shirts that were all stacked like this in cabinets behind the counters, and I used to pretend that they needed refolding to look really neat. So I used to sit there and fix up any shirt that didn't look quite right and repin it all. I got really good at that and put it back on the shelf. So the shirts there always looked perfect because I needed the money and they wouldn't send me home if I was repinning all these shirts. But so I did that all the way through high school. And the store was open Monday nights and of course Saturdays. When I was a little kid before I could work, my friend and I used to walk down to the Michigan Stadium. So I'm a big Michigan football fan. And we used to stand outside the gates of the stadium and say, does anybody have any tickets they don't want? And we almost always got into the games. and one time, a guy was just stone drunk, gave us his tickets and we sat on the 50-yard line. So
That's
I did all
fabulous.
kinds of stuff as a kid. My mother really did not, at her age then, didn't know how to cope with having a child. She was working, and she just, once my dad died, she was working. But
How did she handle sort of becoming a single mom and having to work?
it was very difficult. They had a lot of friends they used to play cards with. They used to play a game called euchre, which is very popular. It's like an easy version of bridge. And so there was a fellow who became a widower right after she was widowed. And he was very interested in my mom. She would have nothing to do with any man. And I don't know whether that was a reflection of living with my dad with his temper, or that she just didn't feel that it was right to do.
Right.
Given when she was born, 1898, a woman at 51, if you were widowed, you would date somebody, and not in her social class. So she just put the nose to the grindstone, and when the church decided that they were only going to have one secretary, I think they probably got better typewriters or something, then she went to work for the Easter Seal Society as a secretary. And then that job evaporated, so she went to work as a cook's helper at the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority house at the university.
Wow.
And then we had a good-sized house. It actually had 4 bedrooms, 2 upstairs and 2 down. So for extra money, my brothers, of course, could build stuff, because they learned it from my dad. They converted the upstairs 2 bedrooms. They built on a kitchen and built stairs up the back side of the house, and my mother rented that as an apartment. Then they took half of the basement and converted that into an apartment, because it was a walk-in basement from the back. So she had income from those 2 apartments that helped out a lot. Oh, goodness. Just
You want to pause? Should we pause?
Pause it?
Yeah. Are we ready?
Okay. So that helped. But the funny thing is, I was on the search committee for, I can't remember, it was academic vice president at the university. And a name came by. Richard Gerber was one of the finalists. And I remember he and his wife, who by then had divorced, Dick and, I forgot her name, lived in the upstairs apartment.
Oh my gosh.
So I reminded him, I said, are you the Richard Gerber who lived at 605 Elmcrest Drive in an upstairs apartment? He said, yeah. I said, I was the little girl who lived downstairs. My mother rented that apartment to you. And so it was, what goes around comes around. He did not get the job. I think was academic vice president. But he was a very nice guy. He was a historian and working on his PhD at the university. He ended up being a finalist for, I think it was academic VP at Fullerton.
Wow.
So,
who were your role models growing up?
well, I'm not sure about that. My best friend in elementary school ended up becoming a prostitute. When I got to junior high school, I started hanging out with a girl who was an only child. And her dad had a dual appointment at the University of Michigan in chemistry and biology. He was basically a biochemist. And her mother graduated from someplace in home ec. And she was an only child, and I was smart. So they wanted their daughter to hang out with me, even though I was from the wrong side of town. And we became very good friends. And we still get together for class reunions and so on. So I met Marion, her name was Marion Kemp, and we were best friends all the way through junior high. And then I met some of the people that she knew by the time I got to high school. But my great-grandparents founded the old Lutheran church in Ann Arbor. And so I was basically, until I was confirmed at age 14, went to that church. But the minister used to make us sit up in the balcony. And I'm thinking about when this rebellious streak in me started. He expected us to be sitting up in that balcony every Sunday. Well, I was sick one Sunday. And the next Sunday, I walked out. You know, you shake hands with the minister. And he said, "Well, hello, Carol. So good to see you. Oh, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, you know." That made me so mad. So I said to my mother, "I'll get confirmed in this church, but I'm not going to go here anymore." And so I had met some friends who went to the Presbyterian church, and it was way across town, so it was a bit of a hike. And so I said, "I'm going to go and join the Presbyterian church." So I had to go through confirmation classes again. But that introduced me to a bunch of kids from the east side of town. And their parents were all very successful. You know, one was head of the Department of Oral Surgery at the university, the other was vice president of an aerospace corporation, and her grandparents were from president, I think, of one of the big steel companies. So that's who I used to hang out with. And I think maybe her parents were my role models. But again, they were all Republicans.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so I was always raised in this real Republican environment. And, you know, I'm still friends with all of those people. We email back and forth. They come out to visit me here. I go to Ann Arbor and stay with them usually because my one living brother is getting so old that he can't cope with the company. But we're all still really good friends. I don't have any lasting friends from college. Well, I still hear from two of them who live up in Seattle. Because they got married young too, and we used to play bridge with them. But my friends were my high school friends and their families. I looked at their families and their life and their houses and where they lived, and I said to myself, very young, I am not ever going to be in a position where I cannot put bread on the table for myself, you know, like my mother was. And I think that was a shock to me as a kid at 10 years old. And so I remember going to Sandy Kerr's house for dinner one night. Her dad was head of oral surgery at Michigan. And I had never seen on a table anything except a knife, fork, and spoon. And here are 2 forks and 2 spoons and cloth napkins. And I think, oh my God. I sat there and I watched to see which utensils they were using. So when my first paycheck from the men's clothing store, I went across the street to the bookstore and I bought Amy Vanderbilt's etiquette book. And I still have it. Because I thought, if I want to move out of the social class that I'm in, I'm going to have to learn to behave in that social class.
Wow.
So my first paycheck was spent on Amy Vanderbilt's etiquette book.
I love it.
And so I think my friends, parents, and so on were very influential to me. But my brothers and so on, and my mother set my personal values and so on. Lying, cheating, stealing, all of those things were anything that, oh my God, if you did that, you were unbelievably bad. So I was raised in this very, very moral, ethical environment. However, my mother was a racial bigot beyond belief. And I think it was because of the black people who lived a block away in the neighborhood. That was her image of all black people. And it used to bother me a lot. And of course, my friends were all white, but my high school class, it was a very racially mixed. The president of my senior class was Asian, and the president of the student body was African American. So.
And this is late 50s?
I graduated from high school in '58, graduated from the University of Michigan in basically 3.5 years. I graduated, and they held commencement actually in January of '62, and my birthday wasn't till the end of January. Okay. So I actually graduated at age 20.
Wow. And
then started teaching. So got married after my freshman year.
And so, where did you all live after?
Freshman year, oh, little tiny apartments. My first husband was fairly tall, I think he was 6'2". And the first apartment we lived in was a converted attic, and the only place in the apartment he could stand up straight was in the middle of the living room, because it went like this. Had a kitchen about as big as that table, but we managed. My mother, if she had leftover mashed potatoes, she lived about a mile away, would bring us the leftover mashed potatoes. I learned to stretch a pound of hamburger for 3 or 4 meals.
Wow. What was your major in Michigan?
Well, funny, in Michigan at the time, you majored in education if you wanted a teaching credential. But the University of Michigan said, well, you have to have academic majors and minors if you're going to graduate from the University of Michigan. So on my transcript, my major reads social science, so a lot of history, geography, that sort of stuff. Then I have 3 units short of a second major in English, and I had a minor in German, a minor in Spanish, and a minor in natural sciences. Wow. And my degree reads AB Ed. So I was not like today's teachers. I had the content background to teach what I had to teach kids.
Right.
Which bothers me no end in California, and it has from the day I moved here, that teachers can make, I think they ought to have academic majors and minors. I really do, because I am a content person. My mantra always, you can't teach nothing. And I would get people coming to me with majors in things not at all related to education, and they get a job teaching, as we were talking before, teaching 6th grade history, had to teach 6th grade history. They had never taken an ancient history class, and that's what 6th grade history is. Or they would come not understanding math, and that was always my weak point, I thought. And it's because of a bad teacher I had for 9th grade algebra. Then you didn't take algebra until 9th grade. I had a science teacher, wonderful science teacher. I loved him, but he didn't know how to teach math. Scared me to death, but that's a whole other conversation. But anyway, so that, and then I had to take one methods class at the University of Michigan, which was taught by actually somebody whose specialty was history. So I never really had any formal training on how to teach reading and math. I mean, yeah, reading and math. I was good at history, but not reading and math. So I had to figure out how to do that. And I was hired at age 20. I didn't want to teach in Ann Arbor because I'd gone to school there, kindergarten through college. So there's a little town north of Ann Arbor called Plymouth. So I started out teaching 4th grade in Plymouth, Michigan. Then the 3rd grade teacher wanted to switch to 4th, so I switched to 3rd, and I taught 3rd. And my first husband was, if you were an ROTC and an engineering major at Michigan, it took you 5 years. So I actually brought in a paycheck. I started teaching in Plymouth for $4,500 a year. And that was the going salary. In fact, it was $300 more than I would have gotten had I taught in Ann Arbor. They were paying $4,200 a year. And that's the days when you thought, wow, if I ever earn $10,000, won't this be wonderful? So that's where I started teaching. And then when he graduated from college, he was an ROTC. They immediately sent him to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to get his master's degree, because again, he was very smart. And so I then taught children at a public school that was located within the base housing area of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And there I taught second grade. And they then, ironically, offered me the reading specialist position for the district. Remember, I'd never had a reading methods course, but I figured out really successfully how to teach kids to read. But I was pregnant, and so I said, can't do this. So then my first child was born when I was 23. And then I...
And this is when you're living on the base?
Yeah, we were living in really cruddy base housing. The low end of officers, and he was a second lieutenant, got in, they were in with the enlisted base housing. And it was really cruddy housing, but we had a good time there. I mean, we had a lot of friends and did a lot of things socially with them. Stuff that we were all poor, so it was stuff you could do on minimal entertainment budget.
Right.
And of course, we were within a huge Air Force base, the officers club there. There were 30-some general officers on that base. And so we had a wonderful officers club. Best entertainment in the world, much better than comes to the Coachella Valley, I'll tell you that. And he was on the Junior Officers Council, so we got invited to a lot of pretty nice stuff. But
And so what year was your first child born?
64.
A boy or girl? I got
Girl.
And what's her name?
Catherine.
Catherine. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're a young married couple, you're teaching second grade, and you have Catherine.
Yep.
And your husband at the time was getting a degree in what?
Aerospace engineering.
Oh, fabulous.
Master's degree at that point, yeah. And of course, that was a big area of interest in the early 60s, early mid-60s. You know, the aerospace industry was booming. So then I went back. After being a mother for stay-at-home mom, and I remember in September before she was born, I sat by our front window in that base housing and watched the little kids going off to school. And I sat there and I just cried. I said, I need to be with those kids. And so in January, there was a woman my age who had a young boy, Catherine's age, and she needed extra money. So I would substitute teach, and I would give her a portion of what I earned that day to take care of Catherine. And so I got back into substitute teaching and had some very interesting experiences. But I wanted to get my life credential from Michigan. You know, then you always keep in mind, when my dad died, I said I was never going to be in a position where I couldn't put bread on the table. So I wanted to get my clear teaching credential in Michigan. And so I had to go back and I think I had to have 6 more units. I had taken 6 units, well, that's a whole other line of conversation, what I had to do to get an Ohio teaching credential. They told me I had not had any physical science. I had geology, I had botany, I had zoology at Michigan, but I hadn't taken a physical science. So I said, what am I going to do? And so Eastern Michigan University, which is then very teacher or training oriented, had a course that they were offering in the summer. It was a physics review class for high school physics teachers. I had never taken physics. I was taking dual foreign languages and stuff in high school. So they also said I had to have no art. Keep in mind, I was always in music stuff. It was always music or art. So I found this art class, and the art, the physics, and I hadn't had, Michigan, you had choice of taking math or logic in the philosophy department, so I took logic. So anyway, these 3 classes, I went down to Columbus, and I went to their credentialing department, catalog in hand from Eastern, and I said, all right, I'm moving to Ohio. I have to teach in the fall. I like to eat. I'm negotiating with you. If I take these 3 classes, will you then count those as my math, art, and physical science classes? And they finally agreed that they would. So this physics class, I had no idea what the guy was talking about. So after the day when it was too late to drop the class, I went to the professor and I said, look, I'm in a pickle. I have to take this class and I have to have a passing grade for it. I will work my hardest, and my husband's an engineering student, so he can tutor me. If I can get a C in this class, will you let me sit in the class? He said, you know, look, this was when a psychologist named Bruner had convinced the world that you could teach anybody anything if you could bring it down to its lowest common denominator. So I said, what am I going to do for a term paper? I said, what if I design a physics curriculum for first graders? Will that convince you? And I told him, you know, Bruner's work and so on, that I understand physics. And he agreed. So the deal was I had to get at least a C on every exam, and then he would give me a grade based upon this paper that I wrote. So I studied, I had a little book called Visualized Physics and stuff like that. And I managed to pass all the exams. Well, he was so enthralled with this curriculum that I designed that he asked if I was planning to publish it. And I said, no. He did.
Of course.
But he gave me an A+ in the course. Now, both of my children are engineers by training, and so I never fail to push in their face, well, I got an A+ in physics, how about you? The art class was a joke. I literally, and I still have it somewhere, my in-laws had a cottage on a lake. There are a lot of lakes in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Ann Arbor area. So I sat there on the end of their dock, and I actually wove baskets with the pail of reeds in the water. I did underwater basket weaving. And then the math course was taught by a woman whom my husband had at the lab school at Eastern. And she was all into just working with different number bases. She was convinced that that taught you to understand math. Well, keep in mind, I hadn't had any math since 9th grade algebra, but it was easy. So, I got A's in those courses, trundled off with my transcript to Ohio and got my Ohio teaching credential. But I still needed 6 more units to get my Life Michigan credential. So by then, I had a second child. He was born in '67. And winters in Dayton, Ohio were no fun. We were in sort of an ice belt, so you get snow and the ice, and he was in the military, and I was home with these 2 little kids, and I was going out of my gourd. So I said, all right, I'm going to take these classes and finish up. So I looked at I took one, and it was the biggest joke. And that was in the elementary ed master's program. So I thought, this is crazy. So I looked at the catalog, and they had a master's program in curriculum and supervision. So it was, you could get I had an administrative credential when I finished it, as well as the background in curriculum. But I started into this curriculum, and then I read the book, the catalog. I never bothered to see an advisor. You just read the catalog. And I realized you had to take 2 courses in statistics plus a course in research design. And I said, statistics? My God, I can't do math. So I dropped out of the master's program. The dean called me at home and said, Mrs. Barnes, I understand that you're dropping out of our master's program. And at that point, it was a joint master's program. It was at Wright State University, which was developed jointly by Miami, University of Ohio, and Ohio State. It was a branch campus of both of them. It soon became an independent university. Now it's huge, got a medical school and everything. But anyway, the dean called me at home and he said, I've got your college transcripts right in front of me. And he said, you're an A student. Why do you think you can't, why are you dropping out of this? And I told him because I couldn't do statistics. He said, we have a wonderful stat professor. Do me a favor. You just sign up for his class and see if you can do statistics. Well, what did I end up in but a cohort of high school math teachers? And I thought, oh my, oh my, oh my. I said, I was scared to death. And so I studied. And I said to the professor after the first day, I said, I don't think I can do this. He said, can you add, subtract, multiply, divide, and think? And I said, yes. So he said, you can pass statistics. He said, you just have to study. So I studied it. And the first exam came, and you know, I was always one who walked out of every exam thinking, oh, I flunked it. I flunked it. I know I didn't. And then I'd get A's on it. But it was just, I really always felt that I was going to fail the exam. So I got this back, and there was just a numerical score on it. And he said, how many, he brought it was before he handed it, I said, how many of you in this class are math majors? Everybody but Carol. And he said, you guys really ought to be ashamed of yourselves. He said, the person who got the highest score on this exam is the only one in here who wasn't a math major. So I had 2 semesters of stat with him and a course of research design. And I always ran into him when I was giving papers at the American Educational Research Association. And he would always laugh that my doctoral dissertation, some of it required statistical analysis, and I hired that done, but I had to understand what was done. And I also got to know him on another level because my son, who turns out is brilliant, didn't talk until he was about 2.5. He would say water, mommy, blanket, and that was it. And I was afraid maybe he had some sort of a developmental delay. So I took him into this guy, professor's name was Glenn Graham, took him into Glenn, and I said, do you have some nonverbal IQ tests you can give this child? He said, oh, sure, because he was also a psychometrician. And he laughed. He said, well, Carol, he's off the charts. He's probably 165. And I said, but he won't talk. He said, with you and your daughter, he had met us, of course, he said, the poor kid doesn't need to talk. So I started sending him to preschool because I got a job after actually before I finished my last course of my master's program, teaching at the university. And I was asked not to go to commencement because they weren't supposed to hire anybody until they at least had a master's degree to supervise teachers or anything. And I didn't have it yet. So he asked that I please not go to commencement. So I had to send Eric to preschool somewhere when I was finishing my degree and so on. So he then started to talk, and he didn't start to say too much, but we were on an icy hill. I had gone to the IGA store, a little, Independent Grocers Association store, and it was an icy hill coming out of that store. And it was probably on a 6-degree slant. And the woman, of course a woman, in front of me in a car, if you've ever driven in snow, you know you don't hit the accelerator hard when you want to get up an icy hill. She hit it, and it was like this. And Eric, who had not said much of anything, looked over at me. Of course, then kids could ride in the front seat of cars. He looked over at me and said, that's the dumbest broad I ever have seen. And I said, let's look at this language construction. ever have seen? And he picked up broad from his father, probably picked up dumbest from me. And I said, what did you say? And he repeated it. I thought, he can talk. So anyway, that's how I got to be good friends with Glenn Graham, my stat professor, who would always laugh about research I had done and then say, and how's your retarded child doing? Well, when I started my doctoral program, which was a joint doc between Miami and Ohio State, I used to take Eric with me because I had to go to Miami to Oxford, Ohio, which is a drive from Dayton. And the psych department used to babysit for him. And what they used to do is give him IQ tests.
I love it.
And they would tell me, and they were always really, really high. But they gave him one time, back to thinking about, and I use this example a lot when I was training teachers, and about looking at people from different classes and pegging people, socially stratifying them based upon their income and class and so on. They gave him an IQ test. His dad was in very, very high-level intelligence work. Basically, technical spy is what he was. All Eric could know was that he worked in a pink building. So there was what they call a quickie type IQ test where you'd ask a child questions. And one of them was, what does your father do? Where does he work? Now keep in mind, this was late 60s. Eric, of course, had no idea. So they had pegged him about an IQ of 100 on that test, which they knew was wrong. So they came and asked me, what do you think the problems are here? And I told them, I said, he cannot know what his father does. So that test is the greatest example of social discrimination and of pockets of discrimination where a child could not possibly ever know what his father did for a living. So, I've always been, even though a staunch Republican, very socially conscious. And little things along the way just kept driving that into me. And so I don't know how I got off track on that, but.
Okay, so you're in a doctoral program in Ohio, and somewhere in the middle of that, you end up moving to California.
I have a funny, just off the cuff story. To get admitted to that doctoral program, I had to take a ton of tests, and they decided that the graduate record exam in their research was not reflective of success in their doctoral programs. So I had to take this other days of testing. And so I went in, and there was a horseshoe-shaped table, all of these guys, and they were all men, in curriculum at Ohio State, sitting around the table. And I was sitting at one end of the horseshoe, and the big name in that department was sitting at the other end of the horseshoe. And they started asking me all of these questions, which I didn't think were very difficult, because my master's degree program at Wright State turned out to be excellent. But the guy at the other end, the honcho, said to me, well, you're a University of Michigan graduate. Is your husband a University of Michigan graduate? And I said, yes, he is. And he said, you grew up in Ann Arbor? Yes. He said, so I suppose that your husband's very fond of Michigan football. And I said, yes, he is, and so am I. He said, well, if you graduate in our doctoral program, do you suppose you can sit in the stands at our football game and be able to root for Ohio State over Michigan? I looked at him and said, if my admission to your doctoral program is contingent upon my rooting for Ohio State, I'm out of here. And then the whole interview devolved into a discussion of sports. And they said, we'll let you know in 2 weeks whether you're admitted to the program. The interview was on a Thursday. In Monday morning's mail, I had my acceptance to their program. I guess they didn't mind my feistiness.
Right.
But, I guess I've always been a little bit of a rebel. I remember when I was a little kid, I was taking swimming lessons. I maybe was 12, 13, and I never did learn to swim, but at the University of Michigan. And the big swimming pool where they're giving lessons was in the back, far basement of the University of Michigan. men's league. Women could not walk in the front door. They had guards at the front door. If you were a woman and had to be there for some reason, you had to walk around and go in the back door. Well, it was a day when the temperature was probably 0. And my little friend, who became the prostitute, and I were going to take these swimming lessons. And I said, it's too cold to walk all the way around the back. So we walked up these front steps to the Michigan Men's Union, they called it. And they told us we couldn't come in. I said, no, we're coming in. And we worked with our towels and stuff, walked right past them, figured out how to get down to the pool. I said, this is a bunch of malarkey, that I'm going to have to freeze my buns off walking all the way around and get in the back door. So I think I was born with this rebellious spirit, but still the moral and ethical values of the Republican community in Ann Arbor. And so I was probably a bit schizophrenic.
Were you involved in politics at all when you were in Ohio and Michigan?
Not really. Nope. No, not really. But I was always a political junkie. I still have the news on, a lot. And I stay up. Since he's not on out here until 12:30 at night now, I love Charlie Rose and his interviews. And that's my feast. And I read The Economist magazine and subscribe to 2 newspapers and stuff. So I've always been a real political junkie.
And where do you think your parents' Republican values came from, or why they became members of the Republican Party?
I really don't know that, Natalie, and I didn't ask them. All I knew was that they were Republicans. And I thought they were good people. So I was a Republican. And then I started learning, I've always been I'm fiscally conservative, always have been, because I've always been the one who managed the family budgets and so on. I believe in a very strong defense, and I think that our strong defense system, when Reagan was president, is what broke down the wall, because Russia, or Soviet Union then, was scared to death of what we might do to them. And, I guess I'm a speak softly, except I don't, and carry a big stick. So that's where probably those values came from. But I am socially very liberal. I am very pro-choice. I have no issues at all with gay marriage. I believe in equal rights for everybody. But I don't believe in protected classes. Mm-hmm. So I think everybody should be able to compete for any job that you're qualified to do. And so as I say, I've got a real mix of political leanings. Sometimes I'm torn.
All right, so I think we were talking about your political, so when and why did you move to California? I had like 20 quarter units into a doctoral program. It was nothing. In that joint doc with Miami University and Ohio State, he got a good job offer. When we were at Wright-Patterson, he spent 5 years military, and then he just changed uniforms and became a civilian on base. And he was doing a lot of work with Hughes Aircraft Company, and they made him a very good job offer in Fullerton. Okay.
So.
And what year was that?
72.
So where did you live when you moved out to California?
We lived in the houses. There's a housing development was just being built right across State College. It was called Fullerton Creek Homes. If you go north on State College, to the corner of, to the corner of State College, and so you just turn left and you go into those homes there. We bought a house there. Oh, the funny story about that was, are you taping or not? Oh, you're taping, okay. they brought us out to look for houses. We spent the Saturday looking at resale homes, and then Sunday looking at this. And we liked those new homes, and we picked one out on a lot and went back to Dayton, which then we were living in an area called Beaver Creek. But the salesperson called us, and he said, well, now, I want to make sure that you know that a block away from the house you're choosing, there's a Chicano family. And I said, what's Chicano? My husband's boss's boss had a PhD from Stanford, was from Mexico or Central America or somewhere, and I never thought anything about anybody who was Hispanic being somebody bad in the neighborhood. Now in Ann Arbor, when I was growing up a kid, if a black moved into the neighborhood, the housing values plummeted. Well, that was true in Ohio also. Gary had a black guy who worked for him. He used to come over to the house, and so we were friends. They thought the whole division that they were working for, it was Foreign Technology Division, was going to be moved to Florida at the time. And we were all laughing. A bunch of them were over in our family room. And the black guy said, look, I got it figured out. I'll move there first and buy a house. And then all the housing values will plummet. And if you guys then buy houses at lower cost, then you pay me 10% of what you saved by buying this house. So the only thing that I ever thought was going to have any effect was if a black person moved into the neighborhood. So we bought this house. I never did get to know the Chicano family. They weren't active in the neighborhood, but directly across the street from us was a black family. And the salesperson in the homes didn't say anything about that, but they were a lovely family. He was a lieutenant in the police force, and she was a psychologist. And they both had master's degrees. Their son, Bernie, was my son's best friend. But remember I told you my mother was a real bigot. She was at our house one day. She'd come out from Ann Arbor to visit us. And she actually said to my son, that little nigger boy across the street came over to play with you. I went ballistic. You will never use that word in front of my children again. Never, ever. She used to sing a real song to me when I was a kid. It went, Stephen had a dog, his name was Abu, barked up a tree, thought he saw a coon. Now that was a slang word. Stephen took his gun, put his finger on the trigger, slam bang went the gun, down came the nigger with a ho ho he. I mean, she used to sing that to me as a child. And I used to say, something is wrong with this. But I had my mother in tears. I said, you will never, ever use that word in my household, ever, period. And I was raised in a very, very bigoted environment. I mean, and we have very close friends now. She's just retired the last few years as Associate Dean of Health and Human Services at San Diego State. And he's an accountant, and they're African American. To this day, I mean, they come to visit us. They live in Vista. In fact, they're coming up in a few weekends. We see them usually every other weekend because we have a condo in Encinitas. When my brother was still able to travel, if he had known that a black couple slept in that bed, he probably would never have slept in that bed.
Wow, so he really took
Oh, sure.
what your mom said.
Yep. He still lives in Ann Arbor, still lives on the west side of town, even though he has a master's degree. He still has that bigotry. And I don't know whether I had a bit of a rebellious gene in me or what, but I had no problem. As I was taking his cereal into the office. I think it'd be interesting to study biologically. Is there a gene or a combination of genes that propels one toward rebellion.
That would be interesting.
Wouldn't it be? And I've often wondered about that, why I was the rebellious one in the family, but interestingly did not rebel against the Republican values of family, and church and so on. And my second husband, whom you just met, is Jewish. And he talks about all of the bigotry toward Jews. He has a degree in pharmacy and a master's degree in business. And he said he thought about going to medical school, but at that time, there was a strong prejudice against Jews, and especially if you were a pharmacist. Medical school did not want pharmacists in the medical school.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, so
what were your first impressions of Southern California and Fullerton when you moved out?
I thought, other than the people in my neighborhood, because we all had new homes at the time and we all had young kids, and we were all out talking with each other, well, what kind of plants? Of course, I knew nothing about what would grow in Southern California. And so my neighborhood people were very friendly. I joined AAUW, and this is probably the first inklings of anything political, and really in terms of activism. So I was in this group. None of them, they all were educated women, of course. You have to have a bachelor's degree to get in AAUW. But they tended to be social activists. And
Like what kind of?
oh, one of them was a real environmentalist. Another one this was before the music center was built in Orange County, the Performing Arts Center and so on. She was very interested in the arts. In fact, she invited me to join this group of people who were interested in building a performing arts center in Orange County. So I was in that initial meeting. I wish I could remember the names of those people because they're probably ones you'll run across. And on the initial meetings of how one would go about raising the money to build the Performing Arts Center. And of course, we weren't wealthy. I wasn't a contributor, but I was invited to join them, and I had many meetings with those people. And so I got to then meet some of the political hoi polloi in Orange County. And I think that's probably where my interest in Orange County politics began. And then I had originally decided I was going to sit out a year from my doctoral program because I thought I would go to one of the UC schools to finish up, and I wanted to be able to pay in-state tuition. But that's a whole other story why I didn't. But anyway, so I sat out that year, and I would have gone stir crazy had I not been involved in a bunch of things. I think I was probably a hyperkinetic kid who never outgrew it. They say you can have adult hyperkinesis. You can say I'm always wiggling my hands or my feet or something. And so that was probably the genesis of my interest in politics. Then I was in my doctoral program, and I thought, I've got to get out of here quickly because I want to earn some money. And so I got myself elected as the student representative on the faculty council, they called it, or something. It was all the faculty members and one student.
And this is at Claremont.
Claremont, mm-hmm. And consequently, I figured that's the way I was going to learn how to play the game. Back to my former story about statistics, I decided I was going to challenge their statistics courses. So they had never asked, nobody asked to challenge it in years, I guess. So they pulled out this exam. It was a piece of cake. So I get a phone call a couple weeks later from the administrative assistant in the Department of Education there. And he says, well, Carol, I've got good news and bad news for you. I said, well, give me them both. He said, well, I'll start with the good news. You passed the statistics exam. Bad news is I gave you the wrong exam. I think probably the stat professor looked at it and said, where in the heck did this come from? So they made me take another exam. Much harder, but I passed it. So I thought, well, that's going to save me some time in this doctoral program. So anyway, I finished their doctoral program in 2 years. I got my dissertation topic approved my first semester there.
Which was?
It was a study of college teaching. And I had professors from small public, small private, large public, large private. What did I say the other way around? Public, private, large, small. And I wanted to study teaching at the university level across all disciplines and see if I could find differences, across and within disciplines. I looked at class size, small class, large class, and all of that, and did a quantitative analysis of the questioning behavior of college professors. Well, I looked at the level, the cognitive level of the questions that they were asking. And I found that the majority of professors answer their own questions. And they don't even give 3 seconds for the students to answer them. Funny little things like that. So,
Interesting.
yeah. So,
And then you were the student rep on the faculty council. What did you learn doing that?
They would discuss people who were trying to wiggle in and out of disciplines. So they also had a foreign language requirement. And they looked at my transcript and said, oh, she's got a minor in German and a minor in Spanish, so we're going to come up with a different requirement for her. So they came up with research tools that I had to demonstrate proficiency, and I thought, I can play this game. I'll take the research tools that are needed for my dissertation. So anyway, I don't think were real happy that I finished that quickly. This is a private institution. They want tuition money. I mean, the world runs on a capitalist society regardless of whether you want to admit it or not. But I did, and I finished my quals at the end of my 3rd semester in all of the subjects. So I had 4 different areas. I had teacher education, curriculum, children's language development, and higher ed administration. And one of the funniest questions I was asked when I was defending my dissertation was from the guy in higher ed administration. It's his specialty. He said, well, now, your advisor is associate dean of the graduate school, and I don't think she has training in higher ed administration. Do you, Carolyn? No. And he said, now you just have this qualifying area in higher ed administration. What do you know that your advisor doesn't about administering higher education? And I thought, wow, is that a gotcha question? I answered it politically. So
you finished in 2 years, and then
I had taught the second semester of my 2nd year. I got a job teaching 7 units in secondary ed at Cal State Fullerton. And they had a learning center. They did a lot of their instruction in these centers, where the students were. And I took the Santa Ana Learning Center. Funny experience. And so I was heavily, almost all minority schools, Chicanos and blacks, and the Crips and the Bloods were very active there. But anyway, so then the first job opening, I think in 3 or 4 years in elementary ed, and that was my area. That's what I had taught. I'd taught, well, actually, I think I left out when I was talking before. After I got done substitute teaching, did that stint to keep myself sane, or partially at least, then I took a job teaching kindergarten half days. We bought a little house in a little town called Enon, Ohio, and I got a job teaching kindergarten. And so I taught kindergarten for 1.5 years. Half days, worked out great. The superintendent found a woman who would come take care of my daughter at the time. My son hadn't been born, and clean the house. Worked out fantastically. So I had the afternoons to do things with my daughter, my baby, infant daughter. not quite so infant at the time. She was 15 months, I guess. And the woman who took care of her was a local woman, probably in her 50s, who had raised her kids. And so then after that, I had my second child. And what did I do then? I think I probably, that's when I started teaching part-time for Wright State University. Yeah, but anyway, back to the present. Where were we?
I think we were, you're getting your job. You taught 7 units at Cal State
Yeah,
Fullerton.
Cal State Fullerton, right. And then they had this job opening in elementary ed. And of course I applied for it because I was living basically across State College Boulevard. And Yorba Linda, it was a corner of State College and Yorba Linda. It was in the southwest corner, was where those houses were, over in there. And so I applied for this job. And I made the first cut, got to the interviewed. I'd never really interviewed for a job before. When I got my first teaching job in Michigan, they really didn't care how much I knew or how good I'd be. All they were worried about was my contract valid because I wasn't 21. So I interviewed for this job, and I thought this was more like just a nice conversation. Went out to dinner with the department chair and said, okay, we'll see what happens. Well, the gods were with me. I got the job. And the department chair, and I don't know, I have no idea whether she was serious or not. She said they quit opening applicants at 625 because the secretaries couldn't handle it anymore. So I have no idea whether it's truth or fiction, but they had a lot of applicants for the job, and I just happened to get it. And I think it was because I got really high student evals, those 7 units I taught in secondary ed. So they knew I could work with the kind of student we got at Cal State Fullerton. I had experience. Oh, I substitute taught after Catherine was born, forgot that, in real inner city schools in Dayton, Ohio, ones that they used to lock them, chain them shut to keep the hoods out. They called them hoods then, hoodlums. And I had no problems disciplining. I taught everything from kindergarten through high school chemistry. And boys' PE. That was a funny experience, subbing. I used to tell them, they were supposed to take a shower. I said, you either come out dripping wet or I'm coming in. He said, they'd come out dripping wet, I'm dripping wet. But I never had problems disciplining any of those inner city kids at all. But anyway, so that's back. So Fullerton. So I get the job teaching in elementary ed. So I taught 7 units still in secondary ed and 6 units in elementary. They wouldn't do that anymore. There was no assigned time for anything. And I got interested in faculty governance. And I remember when as an assistant professor, I was on the Academic Senate Executive Committee. And they were parceling out committee assignments, who was going to be on the curriculum committee, who was going to be on grad ed, who was going to be on this. And I sat there, and they weren't picking anybody from, it was then the School of Human Development and Community Service. They called it HUDCUS. It wasn't a College of Education or whatever at the time. And I said, there's nobody from HUDCUS on these committees. They said, oh, well, we don't do that. I said, what do you mean? And there weren't very many women on them either, believe me. And I looked at Herb Rudemiller from the business department, a big, active guy on campus. And I said, Herb, I'm not leaving this meeting until there is somebody from HUDCUS on every significant committee. And because of the nature of our school, many of those will be women. Herb looked at me. I'll never forget this look. He looked at me like, this person is out of her gourd. And I said, I mean it, Herb. I'm serious about this. So then they thought, well, okay. And after that, it became very routine. And I was on the executive committee for 3 years. I'm in the Senate a long time, but I only did 3 years on the exec. And it was routine that there would be representatives from on the major committees. Before that, it was HSS business, and they called it MSc at the time, Math, Science, and Engineering. And I just that probably was, Academic Senate was probably my first real foray into politics that were going to mean anything. And then a seat on the statewide Academic Senate opened up. And a guy from the physics department decided he was going to run for the seat. And I thought he was a real jerk. So I decided to run against him. And everybody on campus said, somebody from education is going to run against whatever his name was. He was a pompous you-know-what. So he walked into a Senate meeting with one of those rolling carts that we all had, those metal carts, before the election. And he walked in, because he was on the faculty senate, academic senate. He rolled in with a cart with all of his research and his books and his publications on it and said, now I want you to see the difference here on who could be elected to represent us on the statewide Senate. Say a word. The election came, and I won. He was furious, just furious. This was the climate for women on campus at that time.
I was going to ask what the climate was like for women at Fullerton when you got there.
Unbelievable. I remember I was carrying 13 units, no assigned time, nothing, and doing the Senate stuff on top of it and trying to keep writing so I'd get promoted and so on. And women were an anomaly. Now, Barbara Stone, who's a very good friend of mine, she must still be on the phone, was on the Senate, and she and I became very good friends, and we're still very good friends. We see them, they come out to visit us, we see them a lot. She was very big in Republican politics. She was on the Little Hoover Commission. She got the National Republican Woman of the Year one year, and we were very friendly. And she was in political science. There's another gal in political science. What was her name? Can't remember, but she's still around campus a lot. Her husband died a few years ago. She was a avowed Democrat. And she was on the Senate. We were, I think, the only three women, maybe. There might have been more. No, I think, who were you mentioning earlier was talking about before we started recording? In the English department.
Joan Greenwood.
Joan Greenwood was on. But it was dominated by men. So Louise wasn't on. It was Barbara and I and this other woman in political science. We were determined that we were going to give the old boys grief. So we started meeting together to see how we could do such things as get better committee assignments for women and so on. Well, the old boys were paranoid. They thought we were just out to get them. I mean, to some extent we were. But the faculty dining room used to be above what is now, I'm trying to think, the student union wasn't built yet. It was above the library, I think. And we used to meet in a corner of the faculty dining room where all the old boys also ate. And they'd see us, they'd look over at us like this. We just howled with laughter. But we were successful. And so I would say a role model in terms of political stuff for me would be Barbara Stone. But she's a couple years younger than I am. But her father was the assembly whip in the state assembly. And her mother was a well-known politician. They were from a very wealthy family. I think big USC contributors. Her mother was on the board, the governing board for USC. And so, but Barbara was my role model in terms of politics.
When did you get involved in Republican organizations?
Well, I was doing, my consulting partner and I were doing a study of the Orange County Department of Education for the Orange County Grand Jury. We bid for the consulting contract and got it. And on the grand jury at that time was Marilyn Brewer. And so I got to know Marilyn. And Marilyn and I started to, meet together and so on. And one day I called her. I got a thing in the mail from the, the National Democratic Women's Group is Emily's List. Well, there was a Republican one. It was kind of fledgling, but there was one. And I said, all of the people that they send me to send support money for, not a one of them is in Orange County. And I said, Marilyn, this is wrong. We ought to get something going to support Republican women in Orange County. And Marilyn said, you're right. So we started to talk about the kind of women we would want to support. And we realized that what we wanted was, it was really bipartisan. It was moderate women of either party. So of course I knew Louise Adler well from the admin department. So I said, well, I know Louise Adler. And Marilyn says, oh yeah, I know Louise Adler. So we had our initial few meetings. Marilyn was still married at the time. Her husband owned some kind of a firm in Orange County. We used to meet in the conference room at her husband's office. It was off Orangethorpe or someplace along in there. And we decided what we wanted to do and so on. So Marilyn had a lot of wealthy contacts because in Orange County they lived at the beach and so on. So we decided what we would do. We would form this organization of bipartisan women, moderate bipartisan women who were pro-choice. That was our litmus test.
How did you guys settle on pro-choice?
Well, because the three of us believed in it. And we were very strong believers in it. Conversations. And, I don't know what the others would say to that, but mine was, I strongly believed in that. I didn't believe that any woman should be forced to do anything with her body that she didn't want to do. I've been told I was libertarian. You keep your dog off my yard, I'll keep my dog off your yard, kind of thing. But so then we started forming this group, and we brought together a group of women from Orange County, mostly ones that Marilyn and Louise knew because I wasn't that well connected. I knew people from the university, and we had several women on campus who were members of it, and we called it WIL, Women in Leadership. I had a grant at the time. I don't know what I had a grant for, some kind of research grant. So I had a student assistant, a grad assistant. Her background was graphic arts. She had been an art major. So I said, we need a logo. So she designed the original WIL logo, which I think they have now changed. And do they still call it WIL? Mm-hmm. Good. But I think they changed the logo, was what somebody told me.
I've seen
It was just kind of a block W and then I-L. I don't have anything left with that on it. But so we had these brochures made up, and we invited a whole bunch of people, women, to a kickoff meeting, and Marilyn or Louise would probably know where that was. Well, I was to deliver the brochures that morning to garner membership and support. I came down with a horrible flu. My husband drove down there, Mitch drove down there to deliver these things, and he says, I've never seen such a string of expensive cars in my life. It was a lot of women with a lot of money. And from there, it just started taking off. And we worked as a group to decide what kinds of people we would support. We started out just supporting women for election to state and national offices, and then we realized that most women, and we would not support anybody at that time, if they were running against a pro-choice male who was supportive of women, because we thought that's a losing cause. And so we wanted to put our money where it would make a difference. So then we branched out, realizing that most women who go into politics start at the school board level. And so we started looking at women who were on school boards. And if they wanted to run for mayor or something like that, we would help them. And excuse me, been talking too much. I have to take a drink of Snapple. Here. And then it just took off from there. We always met. I'm trying to think where we used to meet. It was one of the, we had an attorney, Karen Clark was her name, who was, you probably,
Met Karen.
yeah.
We interviewed her, actually.
Good. I was just going to say, you'll want to interview Karen. She was an attorney. We met usually at her office conference rooms. The board did. We filled in members of the board. Some would leave and others would go. I stayed on it all of the time that I was there. But then when we decided to move out here, I decided to FERP. And so I FERPed 1 year when we were still living in Orange County and then moved out here. But I stayed active in campus politics, in Will, and got to know a lot of people in Orange County to the point, at one point, I got a call from a woman, I wish I could remember her name. She was very tied in with the Republican establishment in Orange County. And she and some guys from the Irvine Company wanted to run somebody for the Republican Central Committee. And they had identified me as the person they wanted to run for Central Committee. But I was so involved at the university. I was teaching, I was doing administration work, I had chaired the child development program at the time and then chaired elementary ed and was on the faculty statewide senate and campus senate. And I just didn't have time. And then I got another call before that from somebody wanting me to run for school board in Orange Unified. And I said, because they said they knew all of the teachers, I'd get backing from the teachers union. I said, you mean they're going to back a Republican? She said, they will all back you if you run. Because I really am a very moderate Republican. But I said, I don't have time for this. And I said, you've got a couple real idiots on that school board that I would not have any patience with. One, years after, was arrested for molesting children. The other didn't send his kids to public schools and was on the public school board. I mean, there's some nutcases down there at the time. And I said, I would have no patience with these guys. I said, and I'm not going to take time out to do that. So I turned down both of those outreach efforts to get me more involved because I was newly married. Mitch and I have been now married, coming up on 25 years this summer. But I was newly married, and I wanted to do the things on campus I wanted to do. I got the Outstanding Professor Award in 1995. And, so I was really involved in stuff, teaching research service to my profession and so on. I was on some national boards. But at that point, through those years, the Republican governors would call me and invite me to serve on different committees. And so I did that. I was on the board for the Committee on Teacher Credentialing, the licensing board, had a committee, a big committee, that accredited all of the education programs in California. So I was on that board, so I was judging the credibility of all of the education programs, everything, not just teacher ed, administration, voc ed, everything in the state of California. And then I was invited to serve on WASC accrediting committees. So I served on a lot of different WASC accrediting committees. And of course, those things become...
It's a huge amount of work.
Oh, yeah. And they become fairly political. It's interesting. I always say the politics in higher ed is unbelievable, and the pie is so small. And my hypothesis is that intensity of politics is inversely proportional to the pie to be split up, although I think that has been dispelled with this year's elections.
Can I ask a couple more questions about Will?
Yeah.
So how did you get the idea to abandon it being a Republican women's organization and really turn towards being bipartisan?
Well, it's when Marilyn and I were talking and what kind of people we would support, and we both drew the conclusion that these are women's values rather than just Republican women's values. And that's how.
What were the challenges of creating a bipartisan women's
Oh my
organization?
gosh, unreal in terms of people thought we had a screw loose. They said there is no such thing. It's never going to succeed. You cannot have a bipartisan PAC and it's not going to succeed. And there's a lot of naysayers. And we had people I would invite to join who were Republicans, and they wouldn't have anything to do with it because it was bipartisan. And I'm sure that Louise faced some of the same things. I don't know. She's never really said. But it was funny. I got a call one time from a reporter for the LA Times who said who he was, and he wanted to ask me a couple questions. I said, sure. And he asked me, why would I be supporting Loretta Sanchez, whom we supported, when I was known to be a rock-solid Republican in Orange County? And I said to him, well, in higher education, if somebody is, we call it ABD, it means they've done all of their coursework for their doctorate, but not their dissertation. So we say they're ABD, all but dissertation. Now, who was running for Congress in Orange County, and he'd been there forever, was Bob Dornan. I swear to God, in a prior life, he must have killed every woman he ever knew. So they called me and they said, well, why would you be supporting Loretta Sanchez? I said, well, ABD for moderate women in Orange County means all but Dornan. Or anybody but Dornan, take your pick. And so they quoted that, actually. But I said, we cannot tolerate this man. I mean, he would have, if he couldn't kill them all, he'd have all women barefoot in, this is a saying back in the Midwest, barefoot in the winter and pregnant in the summer. So that's...
Yeah, I have my own feelings about Bob Dornan from my early political life as well.
So, I mean, he was just contrary to everything I believed in. So I was willing to really work to get somebody in there who was a pro-choice, moderate woman. I'm not so sure Loretta's moderate anymore, but she was at the time.
And how much of a difference do you think Will's support made in her
Oh,
candidacy?
big time, because what she told us is that she was having trouble getting any kind of recognition at all from the Democratic Central Committee. And so by our supporting her, she in fact told us this. She said, I was able to go to the Democratic, National Central Committee, whatever it's called, and tell them I had the support of a bipartisan PAC in Orange County. And we registered as a formal PAC and so on. We had all the legal stuff done. And that is why they needed to give me more money to help me get elected. And she said it was very important in terms of getting that support. Now, I don't know at this day if you interviewed her, if she would even remember that. But at the time, we remembered it.
Well, and I've heard the same from Louise, too, about Loretta. So. Can you remember any other candidates that you really think your support made a difference in those early days?
I can't remember their names, Natalie, but I think it did. They didn't all win, but I think it gave women, if they didn't win, at least it gave them visibility. And the people who are not used to seeing women in politics all of a sudden realized that, hey, we're out here, and we're people too. They were used to seeing in Orange County Anglo males, and that was it. So Karen, not Karen, there's another gal on the board who's now city council person in, I think, Newport Beach. What is her name? I think Will supported her. And, but I think if not in terms of winning elections, I think a major contribution to women in politics in Orange County was providing visibility and letting them know that there was an organization out there who was supportive of women being elected to office. Marilyn has, I'm sure, stories to tell beyond belief. When she ran, did she tell you the story about the mailbox?
She didn't tell me the whole story. I never got the whole story. Can you tell me the whole story?
Well, I can tell you what she told me, but she said they got up one day, went to the mailbox to get the mail, and there was a dead fetus in the mailbox because she was a pro-choice Republican woman.
Yeah.
Now, you probably should not quote that without getting permission from Marilyn.
Right.
But that's some background information. That's how vitriolic things were for women.
And Will supported Marilyn.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
I thought that went without saying.
know, of course. So what do you think Will's greatest accomplishment has been over the years?
I think that providing a sense of support and visibility for women in politics and giving seed money to people so that they knew that somebody supported them to the point that they were willing to put some money into their candidacy.
That's wonderful.
So I was curious, what did Marilyn and Louise answer to that question?
Well, Louise talked about the sense that she couldn't believe that it still existed today. You know, she really spent a bunch of time about that. And Marilyn, I asked her what her greatest political accomplishment was, and she said Will. Above anything she did in the assembly, that Will to her was her greatest
crowning glory.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's for that reason. It's the women knowing that there was an organization of women who could support them, and the visibility that the support that we gave them enabled them to get.
And I think it's still like that today.
Yeah, I do too. I would have stayed active had I not moved out here. But getting in there for meetings and stuff, especially when they have morning meetings, because I taught too many night graduate classes. I'm a night person. I stay up till 1 o'clock in the morning. I would never make it. A 9 o'clock meeting? You gotta be kidding. I don't even do that out here. Except once in a while, I will sub in a bridge group that meets at 9:30. That's my big sacrifice.
So what do you think are the unique challenges that women face when they're running for office?
I think there is still a great deal of prejudice against women because women are supposed to they're supposed to be mothers and wives and teachers and nurses. When I told my mother when I was in 10th grade that I wanted to be an attorney, the walls in our house were kind of this color with white baseboards and stuff. She turned almost this color and looked at me and said, "Carol, ladies are teachers or nurses." And I think there are generations of men who were raised by mothers like mine who thought if women worked, they should be teachers or nurses. And that prejudice still exists. And I think that women, by biology, tend to take some time off to have children, and that puts them a little out of the loop when it comes to promotions. And I think that's why you don't see as many women CEOs and so on. Well, besides the prejudice against women, but they may have taken out 3 years from their work time when they were having children and then they had to go back in to the work environment, maybe at a lower step, and men were already here at their age, and they were there and had to work up. There's a great, still remains a great deal of thinking by older women and by men that women just shouldn't be doing those things. It's just not our nature. Well, you know, Mary, you know, Natalie, come on. We're not supposed to do those things.
In what ways do you think women are judged differently from men who are in
Oh, well, let's take the perfect example. If a woman screams and yells, she's aggressive. If a man does, he's assertive. I mean, that's an old saw. You've heard it many times. And women are expected to be ladylike. We're supposed to, I shouldn't be dressing like this. I shouldn't have slacks on. I should have a dress on and hose and high heels, and I should be saying, yes, Natalie. Oh, I agree with you. That's very nice. Instead of, what are you talking about? So I think there's still a great deal of that out there. It's probably going to take until my children are not that way. My daughter was vice president of a huge architecture and engineering firm and in charge of their whole East Coast. She was building airports. And she's now executive corporate manager of, I think, corporate real estate for American Airlines. I don't know her title, something like that for American Airlines. She just got tired of the rat race with the company. Loved working for the company. Her boss about died when she told him he was quitting. But and my son is vice president of Beck & Dickinson. Mitch's sons, one is a CEO of a small company, and the other has the second largest law firm in Pasadena. I mean, our kids are all, for their wives. Now, my one daughter-in-law is not working outside the home, but she did for quite a while. She's a speech-language therapist. As her master's degree from San Diego State, taught a little bit for them. But their wives are all professional type women. And so they're not going to have the prejudices that my generation grew up with. I remember my son, I was driving down Beach Boulevard with him one day because I was living in La Habra at the time. My back fence was the Fullerton city limit. And I was just curious how my working was affecting his mentality. So at that time, he thought he wanted to be a doctor. So I said, Eric, when you grow up, are you going to get married? And he said, oh, yeah. And I said, what do you think your wife will do? And he said, well, I want to be a doctor, so I think she'll be a malpractice attorney. He was in about third grade at the time. And when he was in kindergarten, we moved here, and he had a girlfriend in preschool, little blonde, she was his girlfriend. Moved here, told me he had a new girlfriend. And I said, well, trying to think like a 5-year-old. I said, well, what do you like about her? Is she pretty? He said, yeah. And I said, what is it that makes her really attractive to you? He said, she's smart, and I don't want to have dumb kids. So the generation of my children, your generation, have a different attitude toward this, but you've still got an awful lot of old guard, and thank God my husband isn't like this. I mean, my first husband.
I was going to ask you how he felt about you working and all.
Told me one time, and it's nice that you have a hobby that pays you a little money, meaning my job at the university. And when I was on the statewide faculty senate, I got to know Governor Duke Majan fairly well and Governor Wilson. And we were at a social event where I think Duke Majan was there. And Duke Majan was kidding me. He said, how's my favorite professor in the CSU system doing? And I said, why am I favorite your professor? He said, because you're the only Republican. And he had given him one of his better campaign bills. Anyway, so I was talking with these guys, and we walked out of one of those events, and my husband looked at me and said, well, aren't you missed something? You know, he hated it. He resented it. But in fairness to him, when we got married, I was 18, he was 18. Women were expected to get married, maybe teach for a few years, have children, and stay home. That was essentially the contract that I bought into at the time. And then I changed a lot and he didn't. And so, but Mitch, he was, besides being a pharmacist, he was in pharmaceutical advertising for many years before we got married. And I said, you're traveling all of the time. I don't want to get married to you if you're never going to be home. Why don't you go back and be a pharmacist? Which he hadn't done for a long time, but long story why he did. But anyway, so being in advertising, there were a lot of women in advertising. So he's never had these feeling of inferiority, of, you know. But but always in Orange County, we'd go to events. People would call him Mr. Barnes. At first, it bothered him a lot. He finally just, no, and I'd say, no, my husband has a different last name than I do, and so on. But out here, I'm really active in a lot of stuff. But he's really, you know, he had so many patients go through the pharmacy, and he's got a memory like you wouldn't believe. We would go to a restaurant, and he'd see one of his patients, and he'd say, well, Dr. Fusakis, is that? Fusakis. I keep wanting to give it a softer A sound. Fusakis, how did that antibiotic work for you? You doing okay now? He'd remember their names, not only their names, the medicines they took. So he was a lot better known in the community out here than I was. So in Orange County, he, in essence, played second fiddle to me because I was active in the university and the community. Out here, I'm second fiddle to him because he knows a lot more people than I do, but it's getting better because I'm on 2 boards at the Cal State San Bernardino Palm Desert campus out here. One is like an advancement board. I was on the ground floor forming that one too. It's called the Cal State Associates. It's a group that was formed. Jan Oliphant had the idea for that. And Jan and Dick were kind of pioneer builders in this county, very, very politically active Republicans. And Jan had the idea that we needed to make the Palm Desert campus, which will all ultimately become an independent CSU. It's the only 4-year college in this whole valley. So let's form this group and raise money for scholarships. Well, I got through college on scholarships. It's always been dear to my heart. I joined a group called PEO, which I think I'm finally going to get out of because I can't make very many meetings. But it raises money for women for scholarships. It supports a little college called Cotty College. It makes loans to women. Suppose a woman is, all of a sudden, her husband just walks out and here she is with the kids. She needs money for first and last on an apartment to rent. We will make loans to her, sometimes just give grants. So that group was formed in the 1830s in Iowa. Iowa. So when I got out here, a friend of mine in Orange County, Judy Reimer, she was vice president for advancement at Cal State San Bernardino, but she was active in that group. So when I came out here, I joined that. And then Jan Oliphant was getting this group together to start a new group at the Palm Desert campus. And we've raised, and I've been on that group. I was the founding board member of that. And I've been on that since its inception. So I do a lot of speaking at like Rotary clubs and things like that to get people to join and make them more aware of the programs that are offered here and so on. Well, and then I had the idea to start a group of a subset of that group of retired faculty members and try to get them involved. Well, I didn't have, I had my old faculty directory from Fullerton, and there were some Fullerton people out there, but they just couldn't get that thing off the ground. So Sharon Brown Welty is now the dean out here, and her husband was former president of Cal State University of Fresno, called Fresno State. And she thought, hey, this is not a bad idea. So she put her advancement person to work. And so I worked with her, and I was on the founding board of what is called the Emeriti Society, which we now have about 100 retired faculty and administrators in.
Awesome.
And to become supporters of the university. A lot of people I knew. Sal Rinella used to be vice president at Cal State Fullerton. He went to, he became president, one of the places in Memphis. It was Peabody, or I don't know which university, but he's part of that. Of how men are so prejudiced against intelligent women. Well, I used to attend a group out here called the Forum, where they would take it's here in Sun City, so it's all over 55, which supports what I'm saying about the generation that,
Right.
And they'd take hot topics of the day, they'd have somebody come and speak on them, and then we'd be in discussion groups afterward. And there was this guy who was shooting down everything, I would say, and a discussion came up of string theory. Well, I had been reading some stuff on string theory because it was something I knew nothing about. And so I started in arguing with him about string theory. And he said, well, what do you know about string theory? And I said, well, I've actually been doing some reading on it. And he said, well, who have you been reading? And I gave him the person's name. He kind of went, well, he is the authority. And so we were in the elevator going down. And he said, he introduced himself as Dr. So-and-so. And I said, well, I am Dr. Russikow. And he said, what kind of a doctor are you? I said, I'm a PhD. He said, in what? And I said, well, basically in education, but children's language development and so on. He said, education. Mine is in physics. And I said, very nice. And who won the argument today? I just don't put up with that. But women my age, I remember it had to have been between 1980 and 85, because I remember what house I was living in. I was reading an article, it was either in Forbes or Fortune, one of those magazines, about that cusp of time being when, before that, executives in industry were sort of judged if their wives worked or not. If their wives were employed outside the home, they were looked down upon as not being able to support their families sufficiently. Their wives had to work. And at about that time, the needle started going the other direction. They looked at men, and if their wives were not professional women, they thought, well, you married a dummy. So there was a cusp of time, sometime between 80 and 85, that article was written, and I'm not sure just when or which of those two magazines, but it was in an article. It wasn't an article that totally focused on that, but that really struck me
Right.
As being a significant turning point for women in relationships with other men.
Well, let's stick with the gender thing for a minute more. And
Sure.
Why do you think it's important for women to be involved in politics?
Well, for Pete's sake, we're more than 50% of the population, and we have brains, we have needs, we have issues that are, some issues really relate more to us than men, but as far as I'm concerned, national defense is high on my list. My son graduated from the Naval Academy. My daughter was a naval officer for 8 years. And I'm high. My first husband was, of course, military. Mitch had been in the Army. I am so pro a strong defense system. And to me, that's a woman's issue. Do I want my grandchildren wiped off the face of the earth? No way. No way. And so there are issues like that that, to me, should be women's issues. Then there are other issues like who controls my body that I think are women's issues. Now, men would say they have a right in there too. Well, I was the father of that. Well, yeah, and you're giving him support money? Of course, yeah, right. Don't get me going on that one. But things like that, and that's what we found with Will, informing Will. There were issues that, regardless of your political orientation, are ones that we need women in office to talk about and to recognize and understand. And I think sometimes I think men just can't understand some of these things. But really, men who are open-minded like my husband is, they understand these issues and would speak up for women. But there's still a lot of men out there who do not. And in a community like this, which is an over 55 community, you run into the ones like I talked about at the forum.
Right.
And I'll tell you another funny story. Jack Coleman, who lives out here now, he was academic vice president at Cal State Fullerton. And we became friends. And we had a search committee. You know, the university has a search committee for everything. If you want to hire an aunt, you've got a search committee. And so, then search committee for, I don't know, some associate vice president. And Jack was on it, I was on it, Barbara Stone was on it. And it was then National Secretaries Week, fell during the week that we were meeting in the search committee. Jack was always late to these meetings. So Jack was a retired Air Force colonel, Texas gentleman, always opened the door for women and so on. The women on campus thought he was anti-women. He was not at all, but it was his culture. But anyway, Barbara and I said, it was Barbara's idea actually, so we ought to, Jack was the last one to show up at the first meeting of this committee, so we elected him secretary. He's got a secretary to type up these minutes and stuff. So he was late to the meeting the day that was National Secretary. In fact, I think it was actual National Secretary's Day. So Barbara and I ran down to the grocery store. It was the Alpha Beta. It used to be on the corner of Raymond and Chapman, I think. Went up a little bud vase with a rose. And Barbara says, I've got a pair of pantyhose in my office. So we put a bowl around the pantyhose, and because Jack was characteristically late, and he always sat in some place, we met in his conference room. Put the bud vase there in the pantyhose. And Jack came in and looked at him and said, what's this? And Barbara and I said, it's National Secretary's Day, and we wanted to honor you. So we had fun with the old boys.
Right.
There was a guy in the math department that he was a totally religious right guy, very bigoted, anti-women. And he was on the executive committee of the statewide Senate one time. And of course, he never wanted to hear anything that the women said. So one time I bought a big box of those fat Crayola crayons. Oh, I know what the issue was. It was science, the guys in the ones in the science departments, who were basically science ed people, wanted to form a separate department called science education. And they wanted to have courses for elementary teachers. They wouldn't have to take the hard science courses in the departments. They could take these science ed classes. And I was an assistant professor. I said, this is wrong. I said, we need elementary teachers who know and understand science, not just the methods courses. And I kept with my mantra, you can't teach nothing.
Right.
And so the guy who was in science ed came over one time to my office, sitting in my office, screaming in my face to remember that I was just an assistant professor, basically threatening me. And I told him, get out of my office. And the other guy in the math department who was like this, I sent him this big fat box of Crayola crayons. I can't even remember his name anymore. Let's just say Joe. It wasn't Joe. But I said, Joe, there are more colors in this world than black and white. And I sent it through campus mail to him. I mean, you wouldn't believe the attitude of men toward professional women.
Right.
And of course, Barbara saw an enormous amount being a Republican women's leader.
Right.
So, you know, it was.
I was going to say, what was it like being a woman Republican in the era when you really got engaged?
Oh, well, the men on campus looked at me like I was this thing from Mars, that I was a Republican woman, because there weren't very many Republican women on campus. And if they were, they didn't say anything, because it was not PC to be a Republican in a higher ed situation. That's just the way it is. Barbara was, I was. There was a guy in the psych department who's long gone named George Watson, who was an active Republican, made a lot of money. And people in the School of Business, a lot of them were Republicans, but they never really were engaged too much.
Right.
But most everybody else was a Democrat.
Right.
And so they really did look at me as, they liked me. And I gained the support of the guys in the science, and because I would not support a separate department for science education and absolve just dumb teachers from taking the hard classes. And of course, look at this again from a women's issue.
Right.
Who were most of the elementary teachers at that time? Women. Could we understand science? Of course not. So a lot of stuff went on back then. I used to get, all the guys on campus would send me all their women students who had recently been divorced and didn't know how to cope. And they would come to talk with the men, they'd all send them over to see me. I felt like I was running a counseling service for recently divorced women because I had been divorced.
And that's why they send them to you?
And also I was a woman. And I was a woman they liked. In spite of the fact, we could like you even though she's a Republican. And I knew a lot of them.
Right. Do you see a difference between the way men and women lead?
Yeah, there's a lot of research on this, as I'm sure you know. Women, and I look at myself when I was chair of two different departments, and I headed up a huge statewide program when there was a massive shortage of teachers. We worked with people from all of the campuses and developed a kind of a basic of, it was one of the first really online courses where people could work full-time as a teacher without a credential. They get an emergency credential and take their courses online. Then we had faculty members out supervising them all over everywhere. And with the team of faculty, the hotshots from the different campuses, I was in charge of developing all the curriculum for that, headed up that whole curriculum thing. But I lead, and most of the women I know, lead by consensus. We bring women together, or men, or whomever we're leading. I don't care who it is. I've certainly chaired an awful lot of committees where I was one of the few women on it. I'll have one more story to tell you about that. But we try to get together, we share ideas, and then we come to consensus on things. And I find that I've noticed in groups where there are women leaders, very often by the time you get to take a vote on something, consensus has already been achieved. I chaired a committee in Sun City called the Compliance Committee, which is where all of the people who don't behave or want to protest traffic things, don't speed in here, by the way, you get a ticket. I'll get a ticket and I'll send it to you. I'm ready to resign from it because I'm sick of seeing the 2% of the people who cause 95% of the problems. But people who do things they shouldn't do. And I chaired that committee for 3 years. And by the time, and I used Robert's Rules of Order, we reported directly to the board. And by the time we came to a vote, I started out with more men on the committee than women, but it's pretty much equal now because I've been saying we need more women. We needed another attorney on the committee. We needed another CHP officer because a lot of traffic violations, people run stop signs, and you get a ticket. So, but by the time we got to calling for, asking for somebody needs to make a motion and second it, we'd pretty much reached consensus. And I don't see that as much in groups run by men. They will take input, but ultimately they feel like Harry Truman, the buck stops here. And so I've got to make the decision on this. I find that quite often. One time, another instance back when engineering was having trouble hiring people. It was the height of the aerospace industry, and engineers, you couldn't find them. The engineering people we had were ones who were foreign born and could not get high-level security clearances to go to work for industry. And they said, well, we're not paying enough because the pay scale was equal. So this committee was formed to see how you could develop a fair way to hire new engineering faculty that would be a competitive pay scale without bringing them in as level 3 associate professors, because that's not fair to the people who came in as assistants and worked their way up. So the first meeting was held in the conference room with the president of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Nice guy, engineer. My plane was the last one to get in. There's about 15, 18 of these guys, all men, sitting around the table, and I walked in. And they looked at me like, who are you? And I said, hi guys, I'm Carol Barnes from Cal State Fullerton. My fields are teacher ed and child development. And I know you know that I'm the token woman on this committee, but know that I have a voice and I speak up. And they all laughed, and I got along really well with those guys, but the fact that they had to have a token woman on the committee, to me, was indicative of how people thought at the time.
Right.
But I have learned over the years in situations like that to diffuse it with comedy. And my daughter, who is not politically active, but she's her degree is in petroleum engineering, so but she's never worked in, she's in construction. So most of the people, unless it's architects, sometimes she had some female architects who worked for her. She mainly worked with men. Right. I mean, her summer internships and so on. And she's about size 4, gorgeous, and as I say, bowls them over. But the men, I mean, she worked at the geyser fields in Sonoma one summer. And they had driven out of there, the female summer hires. They hadn't had one in 6 years. But, I mean, even at her age, and she's 51, will be 51, I guess, this year. Anyway, she said that they invited to her Saturday barbecue that they were having before she started. And she says there was a guy, he must have weighed 300 pounds, and she said he had real man boobs. And she was kind of flat-chested. And he says, now I want you to meet our new summer hire, Catherine Barnes. She got last place in the wet t-shirt contest.
Oh, Lord.
So she looked at him, and everybody called him Bubba. She looked at him, and she said, and I'd like you to meet Bubba. He won first prize. But see, she had it even in junior high school. I already had taught her to sew. She could sew anything. She's a great cook. She plays the flute. She plays the piano. She's very feminine, but she's in a man's field. So I'd already taught, and there was a requirement that they had to take sewing or cooking. And I said, she already knows how to sew or cook. Can she at least take sewing to her cooking? Oh no, couldn't do that. I said, is there law that she can't take shop? I said, let's walk through the windows area where the displays are and you see which one you'd like to be in. She said, well, I think wood shop would be fine. So she said she got in there, and every time she'd go near a saw, the teacher would come over and say, oh, let me help you with that. When her dad was always very handy, and so she'd been around. She'd held boards for him when he was sawing them, so she wasn't afraid of a saw. She said one day that teacher came to her with a bottle of cleaner and a sponge and said, the sinks are really dirty in here, Catherine. I'd like you to have a chance to be a woman again. Would you go clean the sinks? She said, I looked at him and I thought, well, I probably helped get those sinks dirty, so I'm going to clean one sink. She said she went over, cleaned one sink, brought the sponge and the cleaner back to the teacher and said, now it's somebody else's turn to be a girl. And I don't know what you went through at your age, but she went through a lot of that kind of stuff.
I had my fair share, for sure.
But see, this was Orange County.
Right.
I'm going to take a drink of my Snapple, if you don't mind.
That's no problem. A couple more questions about gender and politics. What would you advice would you give, or what would you say to a young woman who was interested in running for office?
Keep your personal background clean as a whistle. Don't put anything on Facebook or any other social media that you don't want on the front page of the LA Times. If you're married, don't be sleeping with the cabana boy. Keep your personal life pristine clean so they can't attack you on those things. And then be respectful of everybody. But develop a sense of humor so that you can deal with a lot of this stuff where you can turn it around and make it look like the person who is prejudiced against you is the dummy. You come out with the great sense of humor and the poise and quick-wittedness enough to deal with them. Know more than anybody else does about whatever office you're running for. Don't be a Sarah Palin, where if asked, what things do you read to get your information? Oh, well, I read the magazines that come across my desk. Which magazine? Oh, I couldn't name one, you know. Don't be a Sarah Palin. I always have felt that the more knowledgeable you are, maybe I'm prejudiced because of coming from an academic background, but the more you know, the better you'll be, but also the more you know you don't know.
Right.
Mitch, did you need to ask a question?
I'm just going to the positives check.
Okay. Okay, good. And develop poise, develop the ability not to be rattled, because you're going to have stuff come at you that is going to rattle the normal person. Practice taking a deep breath and answering it. If it's stupid, you answer it with humor. If it's a legitimate question that's aimed at putting you down, you answer it respectfully but with knowledge. I don't know. What I'm curious, what did Louise and Marilyn tell you on that?
Well, what Louise said, I can remember because I just listened to it recently. She said, don't study too much before you jump in, because she said the men, and this is kind of to your point earlier, jump in and just run, whether they're qualified or not, and you're going to spend the next 4 years studying and preparing, and by then they're ahead of you when you could have been.
That's very true.
So it was something along those
Yeah.
along those lines.
But you still have to know what you're doing,
Right.
because you'll get attacked, even today.
Probably more so than the men who might know less than
of
you,
course.
right?
No, my daughter has faced that, being a female in a male world.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
she's.
Do you consider yourself a feminist?
I guess it would depend how you define feminist.
Well, how do you define feminist?
I would, on the far end, I would say it's someone whose life revolves around issues of feminism. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs in psychology, that would be near the top of their hierarchy of needs, where it controls everything.
Right.
And that's how they think. On the other end, I'm probably on the other end where I say, I'm a woman. And so I'm a feminist in terms of saying I should have equal rights, I should have equal opportunities, I should be able to do whatever I want as long as I'm physically and mentally capable. But I'm not a feminist in saying I believe I should be a privileged class. I think that, for example, that engineering committee that I was on, I told you the instance in San Luis Obispo, I didn't want to be the token woman on a committee. I want to be there because I'm smart and have something to say. And I told the guys when I walked in besides that, I said, besides, I raised 2 engineers.
Right.
So I'm a feminist in terms of saying that I believe that women need all of the rights and privileges that a man does. And I'm a feminist in terms of feeling that a woman should have control of her body. But I'm not a feminist in terms of saying that this is the thinking that drives everything in my life.
It's a great answer. I love it. So, given everything you've told me about your political leanings and your political views, what do you think of today's political climate?
I find it abhorrent. On both sides. On both sides. I mean, I can't vote for Hillary because I believe that she did some things that were totally illegal. I think that her reactions in terms of Benghazi and that statement on television after those poor people were killed, saying, well, now what difference does it make? I'm saying, how could you ever say that when it was human lives? I don't respect her. I would have given Bill a kick in the pants for what he did, and he'd have been out the door. But on the other hand, I mean, Kasich is my candidate. He has a proven record. He has shown that he can work across the aisle to accomplish things. Trump, for God's sake, you don't know what you're getting with that guy. And the thoughts of his having his thumb on the red button scares me to death. So I kept, in my total lifetime, I've never seen a climate like this. Such meanness, such nasty, mean, reducing things to talking about one's organs of body. I'm sorry. Come on.
It's a new low.
It's a new low. And I find it despicable on both sides.
And as a moderate Republican, how do you feel about the Republican Party as a whole?
I'm disgusted with it. My son says, yeah, I'm going to vote for Trump in the primary. I said, why? He said, because he's going to get the election. And if he wins a Republican nomination, Hillary will kill him. And the Republican Party at that point will implode. And then maybe, my kids are both Republicans, and then maybe from the ashes will emerge a candidate who will run a country that is good for my kids.
Interesting.
I'm a Kasich person. At this point, I am just hoping that it goes to a brokered convention and that a moderate comes out of it, preferably Kasich.
Well, as somebody that's, I'm on the other side of the aisle from
Yeah.
you, if I'm,
Oh, sure.
you know.
Oh, yeah, I'm
but
sure.
I would love to see a Kasich versus a Hillary, just because you'd have two people who are actually serious about politics.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
speaking from a smart place about different issues.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I would too.
What aspect of your career are you most proud of?
It's funny that you asked that. I have a dear friend from UC Riverside, and she and I have lunch together once a month at the outlets, and we go shopping. And we were just talking Tuesday. What would we like as the epitaph on our tombstone? I said, well, I'm going to be cremated, so I don't know where you put the epitaph, but we're going to write one. I'd say, she made life better for kids. And Sue said this, she said, my gosh, I was thinking about this. This is exactly what I was going to put. And she's out of education, but very big into learning styles and temperaments and so on. Because I've trained so many teachers and I've developed so much curriculum and so on, that I have students coming back to me. I still am in touch with a lot of my former students. And I think I prepared them to be thinking, intelligent teachers who could tell a kid, I don't know the answer to something, rather than give them a wrong answer. And I think that I probably made life better for thousands of kids.
That's wonderful. We didn't get to this, but what did you love most about being a faculty member at Cal State Fullerton?
Probably, besides my students, I love my students. Getting to know faculty from all of the different departments and making friends with them, so that my best friends were in the other departments, like Barbara Stone and people like that. Jack Bedell, he's another Republican, he's in sociology.
I know Jack.
Oh, yeah.
Because we used to talk politics sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
before.
Well, Jack and I've been dear, dear friends. We've been to each other's. Our kids, my son dated the same girl, his son did. We used to be with their babies' baptisms and weddings. I mean, we were really close friends. So, and I wouldn't have known Jack had it not been for campus politics. And I just had friends in all of the different departments, which enriched my life, not just for their friendship, but for their intelligence and their knowledge about things that I didn't know about.
Right.
I really, and this is going to sound corny, but I really mean it. I think a day is lost if I don't learn at least one new thing every day. And if nothing else, I learned something from the fact on the inside of the Snapple bottle cap. But I really do, and I loved meeting all those people. And I loved forming will, because I think that ultimately would make a difference for kids, because you've got women in office who will make decisions, I think, thinking more about the children in the country than men do. It's higher on their list of priorities than it is for men who feel that their role is to get a job and be the wage earner and get out there, and that's the woman's job to worry about the kids. You're the one who's got to go get the baby wipes for them, not the father.
Right.
You know, you've been there. So it's ultimately, it boils down to what is going to make life best for my 8 grandchildren. Mitch has 2 sons. I have a son and a daughter, and among them they have 8 children.
Wow.
And I just want a wonderful life for those kids. And things like will, really, I maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but I think it makes a difference in the lives of women and children. Simple as that.
I am not going to argue with you. Having been to a meeting and met those women involved, I'm not surprised.
Mm-hmm.
I want to backtrack one more thing about Cal State Fullerton. I know you were really involved in getting the doctoral program
Oh yeah,
going.
Louise and I did, yeah.
And how, what was that, trying to get that started at Cal State Fullerton like?
Oh my. UC, University of California, thought this was the camel's nose under the tent. That the CSU then was just going to have a plethora of doctoral programs out there, and they were going to be left in the dust. And so we had to start out as a joint doctorate with other campuses. And so we had, the chancellor's office was behind it. The statewide academic senate ultimately voted to support it, but the UC was vehemently opposed. And of course it took legislation, to allow this.
Right.
And we just had a continual battle with them. It was...
And why did you think it was so important that we have it at Cal State Fullerton?
Well, because people who are principals or higher in school districts, I think, need a doctorate to do a good job. They need to have some research background, need to be an expert in something. It's backed by, you can't teach nothing mantra. And so it was very difficult for them. Like Jack Bedell's wife, Sue, was a school principal and she was in special ed. She had to go to USC's doctoral program and do the evening courses. It took her much longer. And people like that, she's a very bright woman. it's so hard, and especially if it was a single woman or a woman with children, God forbid, you've got a parent conference this afternoon. Or, you know, how do you do that and go someplace else to get your doctorate? I got mine at Claremont. I started it when my kids were, let's see, Eric was 6, Catherine was 9. I taught Catherine how to cook enough to stay there if I had to be there for a 4 o'clock class. She was very responsible. She'd take care of Eric until their dad got home. And I taught her to make cheesy tater dogs. You take a hot dog, you slit it down the middle, you stuff it with instant mashed potatoes and put cheese on top of it. So she would make cheesy tater dogs if I couldn't be home for dinner. And her father liked hot dogs, so he'd eat them. And so I did it when my kids were in elementary school. But when I started at the university, it was an ideal job. I had a job offer. I didn't really apply for it. They contacted me. Temecula back then, that was a dirt road. Basically, you left the 215, you got off a little bit, and then it was just a 2-lane highway down there. The call, they wanted to offer me an assistant superintendency. And I said, I've got 2 young children. My commitment is to those kids. I can't be assistant superintendent of a school district. It's going to take me that long to get to. And have night meetings, have to be at high school soccer, football games, and so on. So that's when I played, you know, at the same time I had applied for the job at the university. That job was ideal for me because I wanted to be a mother and have some time. My first husband, I mean, I had to have a routine colonoscopy one time, and I had to have it without any anesthesia at all because he had a meeting that day and couldn't come and drive me. Yeah, that's the kind of father he was too. But if there was a parent conference, I was the one who went. If it was a school performance that the kids were in, I was the one who went. I was room mother one year. Catherine was in Girl Scouts. I thought, well, I've got to do something, and I can't lead this Girl Scout troop because I just can't. It was a day that I had classes. So I volunteered to be the camping chairman. I know nothing about camping. My idea of camping, we used to have a camper, you know, little motorhome that we used to camp in. But so I learned to pitch a tent, make a menu with the kids, take them shopping, plan the menu, cook the stuff, and did that because I thought, I have to do something. Now, I was the angel of the troop because none of the other mothers wanted to be the camping chairman. So, Carol to the rescue. And I'm thinking, Carol to get a job that I can do within confined hours and 3 times a year.
Right.
But so it was an ideal job for me. It gave me some flexibility. But women in my department, there were more men than women when I was hired, even in elementary ed. But when I hired women was the department chair or was the coordinator, I used to say to them, like Hallie Yop Slowick and Ruth Yop Edwards and Andrea Guillaume and so on, young kids, I said, do not miss the things that are important to you as a mother with your child. You tell me, I can probably teach whatever class for one class period that you might miss, or we'll get somebody else to come in and do a guest lecture. And I said, you must enjoy them when they're young because they will grow up very fast, and before you know it, they'll be going off to college. And I think Hallie and Ruth maybe said to me, a few years ago, they always remembered that when I was able, in an administrative role,
Right.
that I made it really important for them. I said, you're in teacher education. Your mother, but you're in teacher ed. You think you're going to let your job supersede your responsibility and your love for your children? No way, Jose. So
That's awesome.
they still remember that.
So, and it's those kinds of, what you're talking about, that's really why you thought we needed a doctoral program.
Yes, because they needed to have an opportunity to be a father or a mother and be a good administrator and still get their doctorate in a respectable program. Not some of these pay your fees and get your B's programs.
Right.
And so that's why I thought it was really important. For men too. I mean, I want men to be the kind of father I wish my first husband had been. And you can't do that if you're running off to doctoral institutions. I mean, I did it at Claremont, which was a reasonable drive. I lived right near the university, and I could get on the 57 and shoot up there for, 2 evening classes a week. I could do research. I scheduled my hours to gather all of my data and all of that during the time that the kids were in school.
Right.
And it's a perfect job for somebody who really wants to be a good parent.
I would agree.
So,
I think we've covered it all. Is there anything that I've, haven't asked you that you would want to talk about?
that's always a question that I always ask people when I've done interviews too. Now I have to answer it. I don't know, unless it would go harping back to the issue of how I was raised on one hand, but where I lived and what I saw in terms of poverty and so on the other hand, that gave me this strange mix of beliefs that I have that I think fit like this, but most people think like this.
Well, I think it's a good fit myself, but
Well, it's work for me. I can't, as I said, my husband's president of the local Republican club. I won't join it. I think they're too right-wing.
Mm-hmm.
I told him, if you're embarrassed for an event, a dinner or something, you'd be embarrassed if I don't go. Of course I will go with you to support you. But I'm not going to those meetings and listening to these right-wingers. Not going to happen. We've thought about joining the Lincoln Club because the Oliphants belong to it. Priscilla Porter, who's retired from Cal State Dominguez Hills, and her husband, who owned the local water company in, wasn't Long Beach, what's that little town? Not Seal Beach.
Los Alamitos?
No, it's a little bit, it's a little company. And he owned that water company, and they're very active in the Lincoln Club. And they're some of our best friends.
Right.
And they've always gotten us, but it's very expensive.
Right.
And you know what Cal State retired people make. Not a whole lot.
Right. Well, it's an interesting time for sure.
What's the Chinese curse? May you live in interesting times.
Well, Carol, thank you so much
Oh,
for
it's been
sharing
fun.
your wonderful life with us.
It's been fun.